All right, welcome everyone to this event at the New York Encounter here at the Metropolitan Pavilion, and for those that are joining us online. So this is an event that I think touches on a topic that affects virtually everyone in this room. We're here to talk about inflation, the cost of things that we're buying every day in the course of our normal day, our normal year. And this has been a pretty significant period this last couple of years with respect to inflation. The government keeps track of the level of overall prices through something called the Consumer Price Index, which is a basket of goods and services that a typical American might purchase in a year. And that index, that basket of goods, this past year was up nearly 10% in price. That's a big number. And it's a big number for at least two reasons, one of which is, unless you had the good fortune of having a boss that gave you a 10% raise, your buying power went down last year. And when we look at the aggregate statistics for the economy, wages in the country went up, let's say around 6% last year. That was still well shy of how much the increase we saw in the cost of living. So as a country, we were impoverished by this inflation that we just experienced this past year. The other reason that it's, I think, significant and worth discussing is that 10% inflation is something we haven't seen in 40 years. I mean, prior to COVID, the inflation rates in the country for a long time were closer to 2-3%. So prices of things did go up every year, but not as dramatically as we've just experienced this past year. And by the way, the last time we had inflation like that, which was in the early 80s and throughout the 70s, was not a very good time. I mean, we had high inflation over a number of years. It was a tough time for us as a country in many respects, but economically and financially, that was a very difficult period. And given all the countless papers and dissertations and books that have been written about that period and the lessons learned, I don't think most people expected that we'd be back in this position here today. So what we're here to discuss today is what happened. Why do we have inflation like this? What do we miss that's brought us to this position? And is it going to continue, right? Is this a problem we're going to have to deal with for a while longer because policymakers or other factors, right, are contriving to keep that pressure on for a while? So to help us look at these questions and understand them, we've got two terrific speakers here on the stage. To my far right, to the left there, that's Jon Hilsenrath. Jon is a senior writer for the Wall Street Journal, where he has written about economics and finance since 1997. He's worked as a writer and editor in Hong Kong, New York, and Washington, D.C. Many of his stories have focused on the causes and consequences of economic and financial crises. He was a Pulitzer Prize finalist in 2014 for his coverage of the Federal Reserve, part of the Wall Street Journal team that was a Pulitzer finalist in 2009 for coverage of the financial crisis, and he contributed to on-the-ground reporting to the Wall Street Journal's 9/11 coverage, which won a Pulitzer in 2002. Jon also recently wrote a book on Janet Yellen. It's called Yellen, the Trailblazing Economist Who Navigated an Era of Upheaval. Janet Yellen, of course, is our current Treasury Secretary and was the chairman of the Federal Reserve prior to that, so a very significant person in our economic and financial history. So that book's available at the back near the book table, and Jon will be there for a book signing after this event. The other speaker is Steve Smith, here to my right. Steve Smith is a senior advisor for Brandywine Global's fixed income team. He joined the firm in 1991 to diversify the firm's investment strategies and start the global fixed income product. Steve earned a bachelor's in economics and business administration from Xavier University, where he is currently chair of the university's investment and plant and building committees, a member of the executive committee, and serves on the board of trustees. So on a personal note, I'm particularly happy that Steve's here because Steve hired me 6 years ago at Brandywine Global. And Steve is a brilliant investor. And while this event here isn't to give investment advice, I'm going to say a little bit more about him because I think it does speak to how he can contribute to this conversation. Steve's a bond investor. And in one of the strategies that he was involved in, which was a high-quality investment strategy in U.S. government bonds and corporate bonds, before he stepped back from his role at the end of 2020, that fund over the prior 2 decades generated a return of near 8%, handily outperforming just about every bond fund you could have found and every stock fund you would have found in the United States. That's a tremendous record. And in order to do that, right, for a bond guy to do that in those instruments, you really have to understand something about the macroeconomy and certainly inflation. So thrilled to have you both here on stage.
Thank you.
Thank you. So Steve, let's start off with you. How do we get into this mess? Why is inflation so high?
This is actually a fascinating question. So I hate to have to take you through this, but the only way you can lay this out is I have to go back in time. And the longest vacation I ever took, I went to Peru, and I came back on March 2nd, 2020, and I arrived at the office, and the guys just said to me, "Steve, it's just the flu." Before the week was out, anybody over 65 was not allowed to be on the train anymore riding to work. And I'm thinking maybe this is not the flu. So since I usually read somewhere between 6 and 7 hours a day, I was reading until I was blind because like the movie Eddie Murphy, sell, sell, sell. I mean, stocks were going down, bonds were going down, the dollar was going through the roof. And one of the funds I was managing, this was my last year at Brandywine, was down 17%. It was the worst performance I've ever had in like my 50 years or so on Wall Street. And I'm thinking, my God's not dealt me a very good hand. So if you're sitting around reading until you're blind each day, what do you come up with? What was COVID? What was it all about? So on March 23rd, I went into my sun porch. It was late at night, and I sat there, and I was thinking about what was going on. And as Anujeet will say, the next day I came in, and for the next 2 months, I almost went crazy buying. I thought that there was nothing more provocative than what we've had right now. I mean, you had extreme volatility, you had capitulation, there was fear everywhere. COVID was a known unknown, but how do you handicap something that kills you? So it was really complicated. But the thing that I came to the conclusion was that the Fed was going to try something brand new, MMT, modern monetary theory. The government issues bonds, and then the Fed buys them back. I was thinking, gee, that's what Chavez did in Venezuela. Look what happened to them. That's what Erdogan does in Turkey. Look what's happened to them, 40% inflation. And so, when you're thinking about this, the government shut down the economy, so they had to have a fiscal response. 20-some million people were left out of work, so they needed to fill the income hole. And the Fed was buying bonds. And so to me, there's many times in your life, you just need to get the direction right. You could have bought almost any stock you wanted. Corporate bonds there was only one other time since 1929 that corporate bonds were cheaper, and you just wanted to buy them. And so looking at all of this was the setup. And you have to remember, when governments, when they're running a government, politicians are always interested in self-preservation. And the self-preservation is actually the signal that you can buy. So about 5 months later, to set this thing up, is that I wanted to have a meeting because, I don't know, even at my age, I wanted to get everybody together. Anujeet wanted to, nobody else wanted to do. But in August of 20, the second round of COVID, I thought that we should go out with something called the Roaring 20s. I thought we were going to have a boom of unprecedented proportions because I've never seen this kind of stimulus. And the fiscal and monetary response, in my opinion, was bigger than COVID. And why on God's earth would anybody want to own a 10-year bond yielding 0.5%? And it seems to me you would just want equities. And so when you made this proposal and I talked about it, you have to understand that my business is different than John's business. I'm not an economist. I just sit around reading, and all as my life has been, I've really been blessed. I just try to tell a story.
By the way, we don't make money in my business, in journalism, but I'm sorry to... That's the big difference.
So I'm just a storyteller. And so, and trying to make a forecast. And the reason this is really important, you listen to the weatherman. I guess you're not allowed to say that. Maybe it's a weather woman or whatever. But that, to me, is not forecasting what the weather's going to be about. But if the weather woman that's on the TV decides one day to wake up and in her backyard she's building an ark, now that's a forecast. So in the summer of 20, when you talk about the roaring 20s, in the midst of COVID being locked down for the second time and the monetary response and owning a bond at 0.5% make no sense, you ought to just short the market. And as Anujeet to say, I just said, well, what we need to do is you need to do that. And if you're a bond business, you just go to an Irish pub every day and just pretend that you're W.C. Fields. Do you want a beer? Yes. And wait the thing out. Because the stimulus was so great. Now, I was convinced of this because even at my age, I never realized that politics was such a blood sport. So when we were locked down and you're paying people benefits, the benefits ran out right before the election. And do you think the other party would want to give any people benefits while we were locked down? No. So no benefits went out in November, no benefits went out in December of 20, till the last week in January. And during that whole period of time, if you look at the economy, it was doing okay. So they came up with $900 billion. Biden comes in office, he wanted to do only $4 trillion, and luckily we only did $1.9 trillion. And I just want you to know that inflation in the 3 months going up to that was 1.3%. But this to me was unprecedented. So as being now an advisor, I said to the guys, I told Francis, we started writing our quarterly letters about the yellow brick road, throwing a frat party, whatever you wanted to call it. Now, the central bank didn't think there was going to be an inflation problem. So when inflation started to rear its ugly head in 2021, they just thought it was transitory. Now, the problem was, other than maybe microchips, if you go to decide on a $20 trillion economy to give people $3 trillion, plus the prior administration hasn't spent $500 billion, they actually created a demand shortage. There was so much money, people just started buying stuff, and they started bidding the prices up. So I'm just looking at all this. Now, this was actually great for the consumer. Not that some of the younger people know this, but going into 2008, people just borrowed money. The savings rate in the United States was basically zero. After the 2008 crisis, the savings rate went to 7%. So what happened with all this money it sent out, the savings rate was like 18% at its peak. So 70% of our economy is what you and I, the average of the 300 million people in this room do, spending money. We had the most money that we've ever had since World War II. The savings rate was never this high. The corporate sector had more cash than at any time since the end of World War II. During then, they had a lot of cash because they couldn't spend it. They had to build ships and things like that. So we had all this money, and I thought that and I was as bearish as anybody on inflation. I thought inflation might peak at 5. Most people thought it would go to 3. Well, as 2021 ran its course and we got into 22, inflation just kept picking up and kept picking up. Now, most of you don't understand, and here if you're really a geek like me into this economic stuff, what the Fed does today, like they've raised rates 5%, doesn't affect the economy for about a year to 2 years down the road. That's what makes our business so complicated. So the Fed kept interest rates at 0 until inflation got out of control. And so I'm just thinking, but the interesting thing about this is Janet Yellen and 89 economists thought that the Biden administration, that this was a great idea. And sometimes I can't think of things, I don't think of these things myself, but I thought Peggy Noonan said it right. These are high IQ, stupid people. To think that they weren't going to have inflation. So when I just look at all of this, this thing just started to play itself out through 2021 into 2022. At the beginning of in March of 2022, as you say, I came in and I said, maybe we can think about coming out of the pub. It's a year and a half later. But I thought you should reduce your equity risks. And the reason was because of the difference between nominal GDP and real GDP. Inflation was out of control. And I was thinking, people really don't understand this. In the last inflation era, it took 2 decades to get here. This happened in literally 15 months, and it was because of a demand shock. So the thing that makes this really, really complicated is that I was telling this our chief of police sells Christmas trees. And every year he always runs out of trees, and I told him Ed Hyman's Christmas tree survey was going to be a horrible year this year for Christmas. Now his prices were up 15%, and he sells 4,300 trees. That's how many he ordered. I ran into him in January. He said, "Steve, you were absolutely right." He said, "This was a great year for me because prices were up 15%, but I had, 300 and I think it was 37 Christmas trees left over." So this is what's real. This is what's going on in the economy. So one of the things that I'm looking, so I pulled this because this is really, really complicated. Coca-Cola had a great quarter, but their sales volumes were down 3%. It's all price. And so what's happened is the individuals in this audience might get this. They might understand the difference between real and nominal. Now, I can never say the name of the prior president because if I do, people have, they go crazy. But under the prior president, people's incomes, if you made between $60,000 and $275,000, your income was up $6,400. So if you think, why are people not happy? The average person's income, its working stiff's income is down $7,500. And the reason is because prices are up. So even though they got a big raise, their money is not going as far. And it's just something as simply as if gasoline prices go from $3 to $5, it's $2 a gallon. The average person buys 20 gallons a week. That's $80 times 50. It's $4,000. Your income goes down. So people's incomes have gone down. So we get into this year, and the Fed starts raising interest rates. And I was looking at this thing, it's like the pig and the python. The python follows this pig. You had this big spending binge, and it's going through, and the Fed is now raising interest rates instead of 25 basis points at a time. They're raising rates at 75 basis points, and they take interest rates to 5%. And I think it's like the opposite of the Eddie Murphy movie, Trading Places. They're now just like, they're panicked. And the people who are absolutely wrong, the doves, all these people in the Fed, they now are like on the other side of this. How could we have let this thing go after 40 years? Inflation was 1.75%, and now it's out of control. The problem is the U.S. government is on a spending binge that to me is just like unprecedented. Now, I've actually been thinking that inflation, it's like running I'm not really into country, but they always tell me if you play a country song backwards, just, and I'm actually thinking that that's what's going on. You had 15 months of surge because I think it was the worst policy era in 100 years. The Keynesians are just absolutely wrong, and they got it wrong, and we have all this inflation. People's incomes have gone down. They've really been hurt. And now the problem is they've just gone through an Inflation Reduction Act. Now, I have to laugh at this. I'm not an economist, but you raise taxes on people, which means you have to pay for that somehow, which means prices will probably go up. And you do an $850 billion, greening program or whatever to buy cars. So the subsidy on a car going into this, all the money that Tesla makes is a $7,500 subsidy. Now for batteries is another $5,000 subsidy. So every car you buy is now $12,500. So I just keep looking at this and I'm thinking, okay, so now they've got almost another $1 trillion program through, and they're forgiving student loans, and they want to do more. And OMB just came out last May. They just changed their forecast for the amount of money that we're going to spend because Mnuchin, I guess, caved. And they didn't raise it by $4 billion or $40 billion or $400 billion, that they raised it by $4.4 trillion. I don't know. Trillion seems like a lot of money. So the issue right now is I've actually thought inflation was going to go away, but the spending is just nothing short of breathtaking what the government's doing right now. And they've actually really hurt your all incomes by what they're doing. So where are we today? Where we are today, the spending is going through, the pig is going through the python. And now we're hoping that maybe we'll try to slow some of this spending down, but I do believe that inflation is going to fall. And the reason it's going to fall is because prices are coming down. And when you read the Wall Street reports, the reports might look good on the surface because in nominal terms things are good, but in real terms things are not that great. And so things are backing up on the shelf. Prices have actually been coming down. Egg prices are down, oil prices are down, natural gas prices are down because people don't have enough of money. And the Federal Reserve has stopped running the printing press. They've actually been contracting money supply. John, has probably written some articles about this, but it's the biggest contraction since 1938. And if they're not printing the money, inflation is eventually going to give. But this is, in my mind, is really, really complicated because you got two countervailing forces. We don't have enough of labor, and the government's doing all this spending to create a bigger demand for labor to do all these things that they want to do. And what they need to do is like catch their breath and just like sit back and leave the economy grow. The economy just has a natural growth rate of 2%, but when you're spending trillions, they've created all this inflation for you all. You all have lost the $6,500 tax benefit that you got from the prior administration. You're now $1,000 behind. And the way you're going to come out of this is if prices fall, and you don't lose your job and income can be okay. But this is the most complicated in the 50 years I've been doing this time because I don't know what the fiscal and monetary response is going to be from here. But I'll end it in that, and we'll do the questions that we have, and I'll leave John doing his thing. But I personally think that Yellen should have been fired for thinking that this was a great idea. And I think it was just the whole thing in the Roaring '20s story. It was laid out quite simply. You just can't spend $3 trillion and think that there's not going to be an effect. And from a simplistic way, that's what they did, and that's what we got. And I think it's a travesty that they did it.
All right. So, John, what would you add to that?
So I'll pick up on your question. How did we get here?
Yeah.
And I think Steve hit one of probably the essential point, which is that the government threw a lot of stimulus at this economy during COVID and after COVID. One of my analogies for the economic setting right now is imagine a tank filled with water, right? You think about, well, is the economy expanding or are we in a recession? You have this tank filled with water. If the water is rising, think of the economy is expanding. Jobs are being created, profits are growing, incomes are growing. When the water is falling, the economy is in recession. Incomes are falling, jobs are falling. Now imagine you drop a rock in your tank of water. Now you've got water splashing all over the place. And it's really hard to know if the level of water is going up or down, if you're expanding or if you're contracting.
Right.
Well, so what's happened to the United States in the last 3 years is we had 4 major rocks dropped in our tank of water, right? So the first one was COVID, when we shut down the economy almost overnight. People couldn't go to restaurants, they couldn't go to hotels, they couldn't get on airplanes. The second shock was the government's response to COVID, and that was the stimulus. The Federal Reserve, which, by the way, is the central bank. In describing the Fed, I always like to take out a bill. If you take out most people don't carry cash around these days, but if you take out any bill, you look across the top of it, it says Federal Reserve note. So what the Fed does, its role in the economy is it manages the supply of money. And in managing the supply of money, it affects the interest rates that run through our economy. If you want to take out a mortgage, there's an interest rate attached to it. If you want to buy a car with a car loan, there's an interest rate, a business loan. Interest rates have huge effects. They also affect stock market valuations. And the Fed is driving the interest rates through its management of the supply of money. And the Fed responded to the COVID crisis by pushing interest rates to zero to try to give households and businesses relief. And then we had stimulus checks, relief checks, first sent by the Trump administration and then piled on top of that by the Biden administration, in addition to rental relief and student loan. There was a tidal wave of money thrown at this economy initially to tide people over during COVID, but then it became a way to try to win elections and win votes. So I think I want to talk a little bit of history here, and I've got 3 historical points that I think give perspective to what we're going through right now as a country and in the economy. One is the 1970s, one is the 1950s, and then one is 2008. So why did the policymakers do this? Why did they throw all this stimulus at the economy? And I think to understand that, you have to go back to the 2008 financial crisis. And this is something I cover in my book, in my book about that, the person we want to get rid of, Janet Yellen. So in 2008, the banking system nearly collapsed, and the unemployment, we went through a very long period of high unemployment. The unemployment rate hit 10%. 15 million people were unemployed at the peak. And the decline of unemployment was very slow. We had a period of very slow economic growth after 2008. And we also went through a period when inflation was exceptionally low. The Fed has a target. Their goal is to run an inflation rate of 2% consistently and steadily over time. They've agreed to that as their goal. Now, you can have a debate about, well, why do they want any inflation at all? And it gets kind of technical. The reason they think 2% is the right number is because they want to be in a position to cut rates when we go into a recession to have a little bit of effect on the economy. If we had zero inflation, they would have less room to operate. But so we went through this long period after 2008, after that crisis. You know, like history, we're constantly referring back to moments in the past to try to give ourselves perspective of what's happening right now. And what happened when COVID hit was these guys in Washington were scared to death that we were going back into another one of those, into another one of those 2008 moments where the economy wrecked and we were going to have another decade of exceptionally high unemployment. And their experience from the previous decade was that we didn't have inflation. They were constantly running, the Fed was constantly running below its 2% target. So as to the question of why they did this, I mean, it became, as you say, a bit of an orgy of spending at the end when there was an election, and everybody wanted to get a new round of relief checks to households. But in those early stages, their view was we have to avoid high unemployment. It was devastating to millions of Americans, and we can do this because inflation is very low. We've been through a 20-year period of very low inflation. So they didn't see it coming, and they were referring back to the experience that they had just been through when they did it, and that helps to explain. And it took them a year or two to figure out that they had misdiagnosed what was going on, because after the 2008 crisis, that was a shock to the ability of households to spend money. Right, so if you're foreclosed on, if the value of your house is going on, if the bank's not lending money, then people weren't spending. Consumer spending was growing very slowly. And what happened with COVID, that's what you would call a demand shock. Demand was lowered after the 2008 financial crisis. The COVID crisis was a supply shock. We shut down our restaurants, we shut down our hotels, we shut down our airplanes, and all these American companies that had spent the last 30 years building factories in China and then shipping the goods back from China to here, they couldn't get their stuff out of China. So we had a supply shock, we had too little supply, and the response of Washington was to stimulate demand. And we got this, that's my view of how we got inflation. So then the question becomes, all right, what happens next? I don't think we're going back to the 1970s. It's a scary point in history of what can go wrong when policymakers consistently mess things up. But there's one fundamental difference today between today and the 1970s, and that's that the Federal Reserve has a 2% target. And if they're going to have any credibility, and their credibility matters to them, they've got to get inflation down. And they've got to do it now. And that's what they're doing. That's why they've been raising interest rates. And they're going to do it at the risk of driving the economy into another recession, because they're committed to getting the inflation rate back down to 2%, which is what they said is their goal. In the 1970s, there was no inflation target. In fact, U.S. economic policy was totally unmoored. The Nixon administration took the United States off of a gold standard, which was the closest thing you had at the time to an inflation target, and after that, there was nothing. And so we had a decade of directionless monetary policy that led to this period of inflation. I don't think we're going there. The analogy that appeals to me is the 1950s. So, when we think of inflation, I think a lot of people immediately go back to the 70s, again, because that's our most recent experience with it. In the 1950s, and also in the 1920s, after 2 world wars, the United States went through periods through inflation spikes when it jumped up and then came back down. And at times, the cost of bringing it back down was a recession. But and there are other analogies to those periods. Those were wartime economies when there was a flood of spending thrown at the economy to fund our war efforts in World War II and World War I. And then when the wars ended, this money was pulled back. And also during and after the Korean War. And that withdrawal of stimulus helped to it caused a recession, but it also brought down inflation. In the same way, we've had that kind of flood of stimulus. It wasn't at military spending. It was at relief checks and many other things. So those were volatile times. The 1950s were volatile times for the U.S. economy. And, one of the things that I've learned writing about economics for many years at the Wall Street Journal is you just have to have your eyes wide open to the facts on the ground and how they're changing. We can refer back to history. We can refer back to our economic models and what we think is right. But, this is what I love about being a journalist, is the story is always changing. And you got to bring the intuitions that you have from the past in the textbooks, but you got to see how it's changing on the ground. And I think you said that you think inflation is coming down. I also think it's going to come down. For me, the next big question is, are we going to have a recession as a result of it? And it's really hard to know that right now. The majority of Wall Street economists today a month ago were predicting a recession in 2023, but we just got a bunch of data out on the unemployment rate was down to 3.4%. Retail sales were very strong. So it still looks like the economy's pretty strong, and these are going to continue to be interesting times.
So let me go further with this, though, with the both of you. So it sounds like we kind of went a little crazy a couple of years ago on policy, sending checks to everyone, and the Fed fully supported that. We're not doing that to the same extent that we were back then. Certainly the Fed is not. In fact, the Fed's probably doing more of the opposite. Do you think they've done enough, though? Do you think policymakers today have done enough that inflation is going to go from that 10% number back to 2?
Well, the bottom line is we don't know.
Right.
And they don't know, and they're going to have to figure it out as they go along. And this is an interesting aspect of the dynamic between the Fed and the markets, because the markets are always looking to the Fed to figure out whether it's going to raise interest rates or cut interest rates. And the bottom line is the Fed doesn't know. They've got it. They're doing what we're doing. They're the second Tuesday of every month. They're looking at that CPI report and going through it and trying to figure out, okay, is the thing slowing down or isn't it? Now, the numbers have improved over the last 6 months. The worst of the year-over-year increases in inflation were in June. And then we started to see gasoline prices settle down. We still have a lot of food inflation. Rental costs look like they're going to start to ease later in the year. But again, that's the splashing economy. There's a lot of stuff moving up and down. And the question inside the Federal Reserve right now is, okay, we've seen some slowdown. Is it going to continue? And the bottom line is that if inflation continues to slow, then they will have done enough and they'll stop raising interest rates. If it doesn't, and this is the difference between now and the 1970s, if inflation doesn't continue to slow, they're going to keep raising interest rates, and your mortgage rates and your stock valuations and everything else is going to be affected by that.
Yeah. So Steve, to this point, I mean, I appreciate that the Fed looking at the data and saying, look, how do we bring this back down? But like you said, what the Fed does today really shows up a year or two from here. So I mean, there's also a concern, right, that we might have a recession because the Fed is so reactive, right? That they, unlike any Federal Reserve that we've had in the last 40 years, right, was when they were doing what they were doing at the beginning of last year, which was almost not acknowledging that we had a problem. So if they're that reactive, don't you worry we are going to have a recession, that they're going to overdo it? Now the other side, like the pendulum swung this way, and now we're going to the other extreme?
Yeah, I actually thought that people's incomes would go up because, inflation would come down. So to actually be more clear, so what's happened is the Fed expanded money supply at 44% over a period of 2 years. I mean, that's, as John would say, is unprecedented. That along with, fiscal whatever, we got this inflation. So they had an oh my God moment in March, and March of last year. Instead of raising interest rates 25, I mean, remember when Janet Yellen raised rates 25 and 15 and then had to back it down? I mean, she went from 0 to 25 and thought the world was going to end. So now they have panicked and they're like raising rates, and they've raised them 5% in under a year. Now that's a heck of a recommend move. The other thing is the reason I'm really convinced inflation's coming down, the money supply growth is contracting. It's never done this since 1938. So if there's not enough money to go around, then the way the system clears is you pay less for this, so you have more money for that. And so what's happening is prices of goods that we buy, by that I mean, the durable goods, the things you buy when you go to the grocery, most of that stuff has been coming down and has stopped going up. Where we really got the inflation is in the service side because people have bought a lot of stuff. And so we're in a capitalistic society. If Coca-Cola has more syrup, if all of a sudden you have more Christmas trees, which is sort of a crazy thing to bring up, and all of a sudden, as I say, retail sales are the same as they were 20 months ago. Now, not that you guys are into math, but this is absolutely really fascinates me about what the Biden administration did. If you think the inflation rate in the 3 months before March, when they got in, was 1.3%. Inflation peaked in June at almost 10%. So if you just we'll say 9.3. If you subtract 1.3 from 9.3, you get 8%. We have a $23 trillion economy. If you multiply 8 times 23 trillion, you end up with almost $1.9 trillion, the amount of money that the Biden administration, it all went into inflation. We're not buying more stuff than we did before. Nominal GDP looks great, but we're not buying more stuff. So as all this stuff is piling up in Walmart and Target and all these other stores, I think that the inflation is coming down. You can see that the IT sector is laying people off, layoffs are up, and this stuff leads with a lag. And one of the things that they've created, this is a problem, is the private sector where interest rates should clear. Trust me, 6.5% or 7% interest rates to buy a house is just not a good idea. For the average person, it's really tough. So housing turnover is going from 7.5 million to 3.9 million. That's a recession. That's where the market should be clearing. But because the reason it's not is if you decide, well, okay, we're going to subsidize reshoring. Well, Intel, all these guys are building factories, and I was telling Anujeet, well, their spending is going from 80 billion to 120 billion. Infrastructure is going from 80 billion to 120 billion, creating demand, which is actually pushing, prices up the other way. And that's why there's a recession in some areas. But when you look at government spending and things like that, I mean, this is stuff that if people would know, that stimulus program of $1.9 trillion, $350 billion went to the state and local governments. Now, you guys aren't economists. If you took every state and local government in the United States, California, New York, my little town of Ambler, Pennsylvania, the main line in Philly, the entire budget for every state and local government in the United States is $900 billion. Now, they thought their revenues were going to be down like 10%. They weren't even down 1%. They were down 0.7%. They gave them $350 billion. That's 41%. The state and local governments are flush with money. That was one of the things they did. The other thing we did when the economy was finally opening up, they decided to pay people unemployment. And depending if you lived in Mississippi or up here, you got between $700 and $1,000 not to work just when, the guys wanted to open up their bars or restaurants and they couldn't get people to work because they were subsidized not to work. So I actually thought, somebody in kindergarten could have figured out that that was probably not a good idea. So a lot of this stuff I just look at, so when you look at why wouldn't there be a slowdown, well, what are the state and local governments going to do with all that money? There's 500 universities of different size. Most of the salaries were actually with the PPP programs. Universities have a lot of money. These are all big spheres of influence. So to slow the economy is going to take a lot more. And this is one of the problems I have with it. A 7% or 6.5% mortgage is really enough to slow the economy, but you've got this counterforce of all the spending that's going through that's keeping the economy probably short longer. And I'd just like to make two other points, one of them that John made. One of the problems we had is we had two wars going on. One with China with COVID being locked down, which mucked up the supply chains. That's finally over, so war number one's done. War number two is Russia invading the Ukraine. And that, at least with oil prices, seems like it's a travesty for what's going on, but that seems to have been waning as far as on the markets. So now it's just that I just think people need to sit back and take their breath and just leave the markets play themselves out. But some of this stuff to me is just forced errors. But the economy is actually stronger than it probably should be because of all the stimulus that's in the economy. And that's just where I come out on it.
I was going to say two things. One is a lot of state governments are now cutting income taxes, individual income taxes. 43 states have cut taxes at one point since in the last 3 years. So that cycle is
right.
flowing through actually back to households, which is something that could help households that were hurt by high inflation last year. But the other thing I wanted to pick up on that you raised is China. I think if you're going to have any conversation about inflation, you have to talk about the global backdrop right now, because there are really big sweeping changes or global forces to the economy that have historical roots that are playing out in the inflation story. So for the last 30 years, we went through this period of globalization, and part of the story of globalization was, I mentioned this earlier, American multinationals rushed into China. A lot of them, the story they told was that they're going there because there's 1 billion consumers and they want to sell to them. But what they were really after is 1 billion workers who were willing to work for 50-cent wages to produce stuff to send back to the United States. Now, there were some real benefits to this for the Chinese and for the United States. For the Chinese, that entrance into the global economy lifted 700 million people out of poverty. It was the greatest poverty reduction program in human history, with the help and encouragement of the United States. For the U.S., we got a lot of cheap sneakers and we got a lot of cheap computers, but it also contributed to this unemployment problem in a lot of industrial communities. Now, that helped to hold down inflation. This process of globalization over 30 years helped to hold down inflation, but that's changing right now as we speak. It started with Donald Trump and the tariffs that he put on imports from China, and it's been extended by Biden even more aggressively in areas like chips. And it's also been extended by these same multinational companies who discovered in COVID, when they couldn't access those supply chains, who discovered when all of a sudden they had to deal with tariffs and animosity between these two countries that they were exposed being in China. And so they're reconfiguring their supply chains. And the global economy that created very low inflation that the Fed thought was here to stay was premised on an efficient system that tapped resources and workers at very low cost and moved them to places where there were consumers who wanted them. But those efficiencies are now being reconfigured because we don't have the same relationship with China anymore. We don't trust them and they don't trust us. And a lot of American companies are looking to other places. So this is a factor that I think is going to make the Fed's job harder in the effort to bring down inflation, because we can't depend on this very efficient global system to keep the cost of imported goods down anymore. On top of that, we have a baby boomer population that's retiring, and that's putting a lot of downward pressure on the labor force. Now, in order to produce stuff in abundance, you have to have workers, and they have to be productive. And our labor force just isn't growing fast because the largest piece of the population, you talk about a pig going through the python, is moving into retirement. And so that puts upward pressure on wages. And it also slows economic growth. So the context that the Fed is working with now to try to bring inflation down to that 2% goal, it's a harder job than it was 10 or 20 years ago, and that complicates the puzzle, and it makes it harder for us to put the puzzle together of what's going to happen next.
Yeah, I want to pick up further on that, because both of you sound like you think that inflation's going to come down. It's starting to come down already. It'll come down partly because the Fed is credible and seems committed to bringing it down. But this problem of reshoring or deglobalization, right? That makes their challenge makes it more challenging for them. But also, I want to go back to the politics of this, because what came up with the Trump administration, and I would argue from the Biden administration as well, is a rise of populism on both sides of the aisle, right? This, in front of any shock that happens, a reactivity that's we're going to just throw a lot of money at it. We're just going to throw a lot of stimulus at it, and is that a long-term issue here? And I think you were alluding to that earlier, Steve, right? That puts upward pressure on inflation over time. And the irony, of course, I think as you noted earlier, is that in this attempt to help people, right, by throwing all the stimulus, all we really did is actually make their standard of living get worse, right? Because inflation went up faster than wages. And so I guess part of my concern is this populism here to stay, and that's also somewhat more inflationary.
Well, what I was thinking, John, about that, the Chinese didn't spend the money that we spent. They spent almost no money. And inflation in China is 1.8%. It never really went up. So China doesn't have inflation. So the goods that are coming out of China are competitive, and they're going to keep prices down. But you're talking the difference between cyclical and secular. Secularly, there is a move out of China into India, Mexico. Actually, we want to build the chip factories back here in the United States. And this is just something that's, it's just started in the last couple of years. I think it's going to gain momentum. But if you actually go look at the data so far, there's not been all that much of a change. It's almost at the margin, but it's building momentum. And it's probably something you could capture in the next couple of years is investing internationally away from China. And I've been actually shocked, because when China went into the WTO, up until Trump put the tariffs on them, the United States lost 75,000 factories were closed down, and 7 million people lost their job under the Bush administration. And all those people just suffered in silence. And, we didn't have any programs for them. And so China always says we have free trade. The problem is they don't have fair trade. And they didn't want to deal with that. And Xi's taken a very authoritarian point of view. This is a whole other subject. But I think at the moment, China is the factory of the world, and they had no inflation. That's one of the reasons I'm optimistic inflation is going to fall.
But it also plays into the populism question in really, really important ways, because I think one of the reasons that populism has become a powerful force in American politics is because there are millions of Americans who feel like they didn't benefit from the deal that was sold to them 30 years ago in a world that was built on global trade with countries like China and driven by global finance and movement of capital. A lot of, I wrote a story in 2016 about, actually, it was the economic roots of political discontent. And I went to Hickory, North Carolina, the furniture manufacturing capital of the country. And this was a community that was just washed over like a tidal wave by imports of furniture from China. And Donald Trump was telling these people something that resonated with them, because he was telling them what they believed, which is, you got a raw deal. And I think a lot of Americans, for a variety of reasons, it's not just trade and globalization, technology has a lot to do with it. The concentration of power in really big companies, including these tech companies, has something to do with it. A lot of people feel that they're just not winning in this system, and they want the system to change. And frankly, I'll do a little introspection here. I think the media, the national media, on both sides, particularly the cable networks, but across internet and social media and everything, amplify the divisions that are underneath the populism that we're talking about. And it's a business, right? You've got people on your side, play to those people, and the politicians raise money off of their animosity towards the other side. And so that's the other reason why I think I think not only is populism a force that isn't going away, but I think that the social division, which is unhealthy for this country and the institutions that are supposed to keep it together, is also a force that isn't going away. And I think we need to address it. I think it's really unhealthy for the country.
So, yeah, John, I myself we could do a seminar on that, because I really think that it's really a fascinating. I mean, I actually never thought about this, because I was thinking, well, besides being able to say the word sad, what the heck was Donald Trump all about? And I don't know, people might think, but when I had dinner with Steve Bannon, I was thinking, well, okay, well, at least I could find out what it was all about. And it was absolutely fascinating, and it was all about all these people that were laid off, and we didn't do anything for them. They just like when they closed all those factories in North and South Carolina, it was fascinating. They were exempt, the fabric mills and all that down there, and those factories. And in 2005, they changed it, and all these factories just closed, and nobody ever did anything.
And here's one of the things that fascinated me so much about Hickory, North Carolina. 45 miles away was Charlotte, which is one of the largest financial centers in the country, and certainly in the South. And the banks in Charlotte got bailed out in 2008. Now, that looked fundamentally unfair to a lot of people. As someone who writes about economics and finance, I understood why it happened. If you don't have a banking system, you don't have an economy. And we saw after the 2008 crisis, when the banking system was damaged, how much it hurt so many people. So they needed to bail out these banks. But if you're there in Hickory, right, and you see these banks in Charlotte getting bailed out, and your factory closed, and now they're saying, well, we'll give you a grant to go back to a community college, and you can learn how to be a phlebotomist when you're 50 years old. That's just not a good deal.
Right.
And so, I mean, I think this stuff is all there, and the country has a lot of sorting out to do that we're in the middle of right now.
Well, gentlemen, thank you very much. I think we could carry on this conversation quite a bit longer, but I'm going to get in trouble if I don't wrap this up soon. So just before we thank our speakers, again, a reminder that at 3:15, right outside at the book table, John's going to be available to sign copies of his book, Yellen, The Trailblazing Economist Who Navigated an Era of Upheaval. I've read the book.
By the way, there's a whole chapter on inflation in
yes,
the book and how it happened and why it happened.
Yeah. It's a very good book, so I encourage you all to get a copy. One last announcement, also the Encounter is a little big miracle in the heart of New York City. It's a place for all those who seek belonging, and so we invite you to give generously at our donation table outside the auditorium, or in a couple of clicks at NewYorkEncounter.org/donate, and your donations are tax deductible. So please join me in thanking our speakers.
It's very nice meeting you, John.
Thanks a lot, Steve.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much to our panelists. In a few minutes, on the second floor auditorium, we will have Peace on Earth, the Catholic Church's position on peace and the current situation in Ukraine. And following that, here at 4 p.m., an unconditional embrace. For those of you that haven't given yet, you can find the donation table right outside